Hello, and welcome to Farm Vlog. And today I am talking about Michael Lynn's piece for Compact Magazine, Caesarism Won't Save Us. Now, rarely do I actually take the time to comment on an article from someone ostensibly from the right, even the national conservative right. And even rarer do I praise it. But while there are elements of this article that, of course, I would object to, or at least some slight characterizations that I consider commonplace among the paleo-conservative right, because I've seen it for 20 years, including when I was one myself, there is a lot of truth to this in the history that it glosses, and Lynn does a good job glossing it. He covers a lot of ground in a few pages. Unfortunately, it is behind a paywall, and I'm not going to break copyright law by reading the whole thing out to you, but if you can find it. You can support Compact if you wish or not wish. I won't judge you either way. One of the things that Lynn talks about is the reliance on the right, the populist right, on Caesarist figures. Now, on the left, we call these Bonapartist figures, but in some ways, the Bonapartist analogy is actually still an analogy to Caesarism. And it's true, as Lynn says, the left has been given to this. It's been given to it this entire time. Think about Daddy G Come Save Us, to If We Only Had Our New FDR, to Bernie's Gonna Free Us All. Right? Now, the Bernie situation never had the exact Caesarism or Bonapartism of the Trump and post-Trump right, but there's a real truth on the changes of American coalitions here that all parties have wanted a shortcut for how to deal with both popular sovereignty and popular will, i.e. that even when policies are popular, the means to enact those policies are not in the United States. And many of the cultural concerns of the left are not, broadly speaking, popular. While many people have a laissez-faire attitude, a very cultural laissez-faire attitude towards sexual issues in these days, religious conservative morality doesn't have the same purchase that it used to have in the United States. It's faded dramatically in the past 20 years, and so much so that it also isn't very persuasive amongst, like, say, evangelical religious groups who largely take their orientation from the moral provisos of the Republican Party. And this has happened before. It's not unique to the 21st century. I mean, there's been times in the 20th century where it is true, but when liberals try to pretend it was true the entire 20th century, it's just not the case. From the 1930s into the 1970s, the evangelical movement was all over the place politically, often aligned with the progressive movement, socialist, the Popular Party, etc., as well as neo-Confederates, as you know, a lot of the divisions in the Protestant churches in the United States were along racial and slavery supporting lines, and that wasn't undone until, well, still not in some places. But the fantasies of Caesarism, Michael Lynn says, have historically been more common on the left than the right, because the cultural logic of the left is largely unpopular, even if the economic policies are. I don't know that I totally agree with that. For example, on gender issues, most people actually don't have a strong, the opinion polls don't support a strong case against, say, the existence of trans people or any of that anymore. Where things get more complicated are policies around children and policies around enforced pronoun use and censorship. And the complications there are obvious as to why they would be the case. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but anytime you bring around children or HR departments telling you what to do, even if the social sentiment is in your favor, that's an area where it's going to get weird. Lynn then attributes Caesarism on the right to various factions of paleo-conservatives, particularly the nationalists like Sam Francis and the neo-reactionaries like Curtis Joven and to Michael Land. The people on the far right that leftists used to be more observational of them, even mainstream right-wing thinkers. And there's been a call, and particularly one from Yarvin's coinages, of retire all government employees rage. This has been picked up by the broader populist conservative movement. Donald Trump wants to break the deep state, even though, as Lynn says, Trump has always had more in common with Berlusconi than Mussolini. As I used to call the Cheeto Benito, he's a lot more Bunga Party than he is black shirt. Nonetheless, his pose as tribune of the masses, according to Lynn, attacking the entrenched establishment, has popularized the idea of the necessity of a Caesarist or Bonapartist politics on the right. Today's populist Republican voters, as distinct from new intellectuals and media operatives, or even the national conservative movement for that matter, to a large degree, are descendants of the old Jacksonian coalition that was the base of the Democratic Party between the 1830s to the 1970s. And I think actually that's kind of true. That the great realignment that you're seeing right now is the settling down of this contestation of this weird amalgam of what was once the Democratic Party's weird base. The Republican Party's base traditionally has been Sunbelt capital, productive capital. And when that was in an ascendancy and largely playing a, quote, progressive role in history, i.e., it was breaking down aristocratic barriers that were left over from the yeoman period of the United States brought over from England, then, and slavery being associated with that, then the Republican Party had a progressive role. FDR brought in a lot of the Republican Party's coalition by economically helping Black people, even though he did not alienate the Dixiecrats. So he just added one more element, the Black vote, which really, even though we talk about the Southern strategy and we can talk about Goldwater voting against the Civil Rights Act, if you look at the stats, it's in the second term of FDR where you start getting more Black voters who can vote. Now, admittedly, this is a fairly elite circle because of the Jim Crow laws in the South, so we probably shouldn't take it as Black public opinion of the time, right? And if people try to present it to you that way, you should ask them, but what about Jim Crow? You should think about that, right? But there is a sense in which at least the Black population that could vote in the South and in the North moved its allegiances from the industry building Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and it never left it. This is particularly true in the Popular Front period. And it isn't when the progressives entered the coalition. I've talked about when William Jennings Bryan entered in with the neo-Confederate Dixiecratic allegiance in the South, pulling the progressive and people's movements into the sphere of the Democratic Party. That happens before even the 20th century. And think about the number of times he was a presidential candidate. Just go back and do your history. But it isn't really solidified and clear. The progressive movement actually has a bipartisan split, with some imperialist progressives being in the Republican Party tied to FDR and then later into the Bull Moose movement until this point. So let's talk about who were the Democrats' base from the Jacksonian period forward. And I think this is where Lynn is actually very strong. I'm just going to read it out to you. Today's populist Republican voters are a large degree descendants of the members of the old Jacksonian coalition that were the base of the Democratic parties between the 1830s and the 1970s. In the Oval Office, President Lyndon Johnson had portraits of Andrew Jackson and FDR. From Jackson to Roosevelt and Johnson, the Democrats were strange bedfellow coalitions of outsiders in the country in which commerce and culture, if not electoral politics, were dominated by well-born, well-educated elites, mostly Anglo-American mainline Protestants in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and other northeastern cities. Prairie farmers resented their dependence on northeastern finance, and southern and western boosters wanted their regions to compete with the industrial northeast instead of serving as its internal resource colony, which I think after the planter class was broken, the South really was. All right, I've talked about this before. While the Southron, the Southron leadership class was not broken because of the compromises of Rutherford B. Hayes, that the South was largely moved at the way that, say, England used Scotland, or as Wolfgang Schellbach wrote in The Cultures of the Feet, it was a culture subjugated and used as basically a resource colony and a moralizing backwater. Now, we have to remember that the planter class was richer than the industrial Northeast and far more elite, and saw itself as literally the extension of the Old English gentry. Right. More aligned to British interest, which also, by the way, complicates this current counter-revolution of 1776 notion that's pushed by Gerald Horne. And I respect a lot of Horne's work, but I think he's wrong on this, because the Southern interests were the slowest to get on the Republican cause. If anything, if anything, the independence movement of the United States was opposed to by the slave-owning planter class because of their association with gentry, and they were appeased increasingly by the northeastern bourgeois elites, who were morally ambiguous about slavery, even if they were largely white supremacists. Let us go back. Catholics, Jews, Mormons, and other religious groups were threatened by the attempt of the North Anglo-Protestants to impose generic mainland Protestantism as an unofficial civil religion through the public schools. People forget this, but a lot of the pushback against public prayer actually came from the religious community. Also, until the 1960s, Mormons tended to be Democrats. This led to some weird things, like Mormonism has a very iffy response to the Civil War and slavery, for example, and definitely a very world racial history, not allowing the priesthood and getting rid of the white and delightsome doctrine in the, I believe, early 1970s, if not the late 1960s. Within 2 generations ago, but, well, 3 generations ago, if we count 20-year points. But nonetheless, we can definitely see that Lynn has a point, all right? In the great reshuffling of neoliberalism, different elements of that coalition went different places. The union movement still is at large, and there are still moments of kind of the liberal elite who would like to crush them. Fareed Zakaria and Peter Zion, for different reasons, would like to blame our anti-immigration policies on organized labor today, which I think is a stretch. And I have strong criticisms of labor, but nonetheless, this seems to be part of a consensus of a kind of central liberalism, which is an elite liberalism. And as Lynn points out, it's a multiracial liberalism, largely through immigration, not through cultural mobility, even if it's nepotistic, right? Literally, think about how you can't imagine now any family running for, like, the first popular imagination for a candidate, whether it's from the Obamas or the Bushes or whatever, is literally someone from the same family. You are developing aristocratic-like lines, and the degeneration of the civic forms that normally existed at lower level politics, which are no longer covered by the media. Lynn's right about that too. It's implied in this critique, although it's not stated. And I'm going to read more of it because this is really good stuff. Cutting the post-Civil War Northeastern industrial capitalist oligarchy down the sides and realizing the various goals of the Neo-Jackson coalition in the mid-20th century required a long-term restructuring of American society, this was achieved chiefly by congressional legislation, not by executive fiat or judicial ruling. The contrast between Andrew Jackson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt starkly underlines the point. Both represented similar constituencies, including the rural right, southern and midwestern and urban artisans and workers. By the way, this is something Marxists would predict about a lot of these classes, about where they would align, which makes the current class alignment of Marxists make no sense. Of course, Marxists wouldn't side with the Republicans, but they're siding with the Democrats and its particular professional coalitions, which are different than it was pre-1980, is still sort of a problem. Both were subjects of personality cults among their followers. Both authorized racist enormities. Jackson's Cherokee removal policy and the Indian Wars, the internment of Japanese citizens and Japanese Americans in World War II. Both were denounced by dictators by their opponents, kind of rightly in some cases. Franklin Delano Roosevelt used royal powers in ways that we don't deal with. And it is very interesting that the current social democratic apparatus wants to write out that part of his history. But FDR succeeded where Jackson failed. Jackson was typical of populist demagogues and campaigning as a tribute of the masses, only to distribute the spoils of power to elite cronies and backers. Denouncing the Second Bank of the United States as a monster, Jackson and his aides, instead of putting in a better national financial system, simply transferred the bank's deposit to pet banks, such as Jackson's Nashville's, Robert Taney's Maryland, and Martin Badruin's Albany banks, contributing to a national financial crisis. In contrast, FDR had his 4 terms presided over reforms that permanently changed the United States and the world for the better. From the federal unemployment insurance, Social Security, wage and hour laws, and pro-union legislation, to the timid beginnings of desegregation, not to mention the successful mobilization of the American industry and science to defeat the Axis powers, which, by the way, created the academic industrial complex we kind of have now. Roosevelt did not do so as a dictator carrying out preconceived agenda, but as a pragmatic and opportunistic coalition builder, brokering alliances with powerful factions in Congress, as well as with powerful institutions outside of the government, including the farmers' organizations, trade organizations, etc. Now, the one thing I will say, Lynn is leaving out, but I'm not going to blame him for this. This is a short article, printed out. It's like 4 pages. Is that to a real extent, there have been a change in the nature of that coalition that have moved from Jackson to FDR and then eventually to Johnson even. And one of it is what I said, the addition of a large part of the Black working class, and even people shut out of the working class who were able to get jobs through FDR's programs, as well as sectors of capital attached to banking who wanted stabilization in that field. You also have the creation of a massive administrative and bureaucratic apparatus that really didn't exist in the United States before World War I at all. And the decline of farmers' organizations, which became really kind of business interest during FDR's term, because the sharecropping coalitions that really helped the Popular Party together, have fallen apart by the time we get to the 1930s. Yes, there's still a large agrarian sector in the United States, but it was nothing like it was at the end of the 19th century. So the New Deal achieved goals beyond the Jacksonian coalition, according to Lynn, but also kind of laid a lot of traps. So the New Deal achieves this goal. I'm going to read from Lynn again. The New Deal achieves this goal in key groups in the Jacksonian outsider coalition, from farmers who sought price stability to trade unionists who sought government recognition and support. In contrast, the Jacksonian Democrat a century earlier had merely redistributed resources from their elite enemies to their elite allies. The key difference between the 1830s and the 1930s was the existence of the later Powerful mass membership organizations, of which the most important was the New Deal Farmer Labor Coalition, were the farm groups and trade unions. So the reason why FDR did not become just another Brahmin bureaucrat was that there were mass organizations that don't exist now, which leads us to the reason why Trump inevitably looks a lot more like Andrew Jackson than FDR. Well, the nature of class and that class base and that coalition has fundamentally changed. Small farmers are a tiny percentage of the economy. All right. Agriculture itself is a tiny percentage of the economy, even though without it, we fall apart. And it's crucial to the fact that in the changing century, the U.S. does have food stability if it wants to. Well, within grounds of everybody, given what might happen with climate change. That movement of the Black community into the Democratic Party did start the seed work for desegregation, but also probably prolonged the battle within the Democratic Party for a long time, because the Dixiecrats were also still in the coalition at the regional level until the 1990s, okay? Like, this is often forgotten about. This reorientation that we've talked about on their social media has been a long time coming. And how new it is actually kind of open, because the period of which the orientation of centrist liberalism dominating is really a fairly elite time in the late 19th century, where there was a battle between Republican radicals and Republican normalizers and kind of just bourgeois upper class people who were doing exactly what Lynn is talking about, where this was a Northeastern project, to now where the Northeastern Brahmin elites are gone. The hot bourgeoisie is hidden and weakened and largely removed itself from that kind of politics, and the areas are largely liberal. But these associations on the coast, now we call it the coastal elites of the cliches of the last two generations, really is something that is hard for current socialists to get their mind around. Socialist bases are in the richest parts of the country, while not amongst the richest people. And in some ways, that should not surprise us, because the inequality makes it more obvious in these areas. In other ways, it should surprise us, because if say the DSA wanted to be able to hold the main line of the Democrats accountable, it would have to steal constituency from Joe Manchin, not from Cuomo or Gavin Newsom. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand the nature of the country legally and its legal geographic constraints. I'm going to read the conclusion. The Rage projects face another practical obstacle. Since the late 20th century, the size of the formal federal bureaucracy has been relatively stable. But Democrats and Republicans alike have presided over the explosive growth of federal contractors, for-profit beltway bandits, as well as nonprofit community organizers, to which many formal government functions have been transferred, becoming less transparent and less accountable, and the blurring of the lines between the public and private government in the process. Unlike mass membership trade unions and local civic organizations of the past, for-profit contractors are only accountable to their shareholders, and nonprofits only to the foundations and rich people who fund them. In a serious project of American renewal, or any kind of renewal, I'm not just interested in American renewal, frankly, must deal with these off-the-books bureaucrats as well, which of course they don't do. And they can't do, because that's the base of a lot of these reactionaries as well. Furthermore, a lot of them like the idea of privatizing government because it makes it more aristocratic. From Hans Hermann Hoppe to Curtis Jobin, this is an old theme. Furthermore, the federal government directly or indirectly funds many state and local agencies by means of intergovernmental grafts. Those who must muse over a new Caesar striding into D.C. and firing all the federal bureaucrats do not understand the complex, stressful squirrel cake pattern of the 21st century American government. Fixing it requires a scalpel, not an axe. Which, by the way, and I'm going to turn this back to the left, while I've agreed with a lot of Lynn's premises here, I don't want, I'm not here for an American renewal project. I'm here for a social renewal project of which socialists would be a leader, or at least communists and communitarians. The larger project here, all right, must be dealt with in a way that admits that you're not going to have an executive figure come in and just change the fundamental nature of the government. Trump first administration didn't do that. The Bush administration, despite the massive expansions of executive power that happened under it, didn't fundamentally do that. The FDR administration did, but only in provisional ways, and mostly have been maintained only in ways that help elites. And we do have to talk about elites here. I'm going to mean it in a very specific sense. I do mean the ruling classes and the subordinate strata of other classes that are in the top income and social power range of about 5%. This is a much smaller subcategory than the way the PMC is generally talked about, although, again, the PMC is used in such a vague and nebulous way that you can infer all these things on it. And this is not just an American trend. We see similar trends in Europe, but the European character of it is different. Europe is not America. Europe is also, frankly, in more desperate energy and food situations and might finally do a lot of its green energy development because it has to. And it will still suffer from it. It didn't suffer from it this winter because this winter, thank you, climate change has been mild, at least in Europe. Although not so much here in the States. Lynn's piece and me talking about it illustrates 2 points. One, that we need to understand our history, not in the projections we put upon it to make it fit into the picture of now. And it is often unflattering to the picture of now what history indicates. What is the Democrats' current coalition? The tech sector, academics, rentiers, young people, elements who are afraid of these groups that were marginalized in the 19th and early 20th century, those outside of mainline Protestants, to groups that, because they are themselves now being marginalized by other factors, feel the need to assert themselves aggressively and such build large coalitions against them. Conservative Catholics have to contend with relatively secular lay Catholics. The increasing number of the non-religious, which is the fastest growing group in America, outside religions, New Age religions, etc. Furthermore, traditional evangelical Protestantism has been largely given way to and lost a lot of membership to things like Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism. So there's kind of two traditional churches in America, and the evangelical churches as well as the mainline Protestant ones are losing out. I'm going to link this article. And again, I know how my audience feels about Compact Mag. I'm not endorsing the general views of Michael Lynn, but we need to talk about these things when someone from a position other than ours is right about something. We need to consider it and factor it into our analysis of the current situation. And a lot of us have given the Democrats and the class coalition of the Democratic Party far, far, far too little viewpoints, and they have missed the shift. Now, the one thing I will say that Lynn says about the Republican Party that I don't think is true is the idea that it has a mass working class base. It does have some Sun Belt and Rust Belt working class support, but in general, the working class is the least politicized part, and by that I mean people who are wage workers in the productive, our service sector, or even in the quote PMC sectors, who are not, making more than 70K these days. About the median income range. And so I'm not using a strictly Marxist definition here, but they don't vote. The working poor do tend to vote more for Democrats, particularly if they're very poor. And there is this paradox of wealth, whereas the middle tier of wealth, the people who make between $100,000 and $250,000 a year, tend to vote Republican, but the people who make over $200,000 a year tend to vote Democrat until you get into the high levels, and then it splits by sector, right? Anyone who tells you that one or another of these groups represents the working classes is kind of misleading. There is a sense in which the urban working poor is in the coalition with the Democrats because it's been so precaritized, it needs the help. We need to be honest about that. Right? We can't deny the to use classical Marxist term, lumpenized nature of the modern working class. A lot of people are in and out of stable employment. A lot of people are forced on disability. Disability has been largely a substitute for the welfare state, etc. All right. It has many pathologies because of instability in employment. The opioid crisis is one of them. We've seen a decline in literacy recently where we hadn't seen one before. Addictions that we consider despair, unhealthy lifestyle choices, and like even stuff as like, incentivizing bad food, which we're now normalizing in our general poptivist mood. I take this term from Freddie DeBoer, but Freddie's right on this. The celebration of anything that anyone does is good because they do it, even when it seems to have maladaptive consequences, is not something we should be endorsing. All right. Like and subscribe. Caesarism won't save you. Bonapartism won't either. And to reverse the atomization of American and Western and actually just capitalist society in general is either going to take some massive crises or many generations. So if you want to understand this, you're both building from like step 2. Not saying we're from 0, but most of the things you're trying right now are just boosterisms for other parts of the status quo, and it's not working. Or frankly, you are lying to yourself. You have to reevaluate things. I mean, think about what the DSA and the resurgence of socialism, which, by the way, as I pointed out, and I will point out in other videos, is that whole step up actually declined in 2021 and 2022. We didn't even talk about it. Socialism lost popularity in the last 5 years. So did capitalism, which makes me wonder what's gaining in popularity, because if it's neither socialism or capitalism, the other isms tend to be a little bit concerning, or maybe people are just depoliticizing altogether. We don't know. The poll is not set up in a way to ask that. Remember, polls get real input from people, but they also limit it in the way they phrase the questions. So while we can use them to learn certain things, we can't learn some of the most important things because they're not asked. Anyway, like and subscribe, hit the bell. Check out the Michael Lynn article if you can get access to it. It really is helpful. You don't have to agree with his political conclusions or care about American renewal to know what he's talking about. It's kind of true if you check out the history. Have a good day.